Why was everyone staring when she walked by? Maybe it was the limp. Maybe it was the silence that followed her, the kind that makes people uncomfortable because it reminds them of something they'd rather forget. The sun beat down like a hammer on the base yard. Dust hung in the air, turning every breath into grit. Engines droned in the distance, generators, trucks, helicopters, and underneath it all, a faint rhythm, the heartbeat of a place that never truly slept. Sergeant Emily Carter moved through the heat slower than the others. Her left leg was wrapped, blood seeping through the bandage. 3 days ago, an IED had flipped her convoy truck. She pulled 2 soldiers out of the burning wreck before the ammo started cooking off. She hadn't slept much since. But she walked anyway, because that's what soldiers do when the world tries to stop them. Near the communications building, a group of new Navy SEALs leaned in the shade, boots crossed, arms folded. They carried themselves with the easy confidence of men who'd seen fire and thought they'd mastered it. One of them smirked as she passed. "Look at her," he muttered. "Can't even walk straight. Guess she's done playing soldier." Laughter followed, too loud, too sure of itself. Another voice added something sharper. A third chuckled, shaking his head. Their words sliced through the dry air, each one meant to land. Emily didn't turn, her jaw tightened. She kept walking even as the sting hit deep. She owed no one an explanation, not them, not anyone. But others had heard. Corporal Ryan Brooks froze mid-stride, a coil of comms cable in his hands. Military Police Sergeant Dana Reeves stopped her patrol, her eyes narrowing from across the yard. Both of them knew what those bandages meant. They'd seen her crawl into fire when everyone else backed away. They'd watched her stay until the last man breathed. The SEALs hadn't, not yet. Emily Carter had never been the loud kind of soldier. 8 years in uniform had burned the volume out of her voice and replaced it with steadiness. She learned early that there's a difference between loud courage and lasting courage. The first shouts for a moment. The second endures at 3 in the morning, when the world is made of dirt and fear. She was a medic, but she never let that title define her. Just a medic doesn't drag a man with shattered thighs through diesel smoke. Just a medic doesn't find a fatting pulse with trembling fingers and keep going anyway. She had 2 bronze stars, 1 purple heart, and a habit of leaving ceremonies early because applause made her uncomfortable. People noticed the thin scar running from her nose to her cheekbone, a paper-cut line that caught the light. They didn't always ask where it came from. She didn't always answer. Ryan knew part of the story. Back when he was a terrified private on his first deployment, she'd guided him through radio static that sounded like rain. "Take 1 breath," she'd said. "Now speak." He did, and a platoon survived because of it. Dana knew another story. The day Emily stepped between a furious staff sergeant and a young specialist who'd botched a form. 2 words, "back off." The storm passed. Then she stayed behind to help the kid fix every line of that form until it was right. Respect isn't loud. It collects in silence. Around Emily, silence meant seriousness, not fear. 3 days before the courtyard incident, that convoy had hit sand so soft it swallowed trucks whole. One moment the road was a path, the next it was gone. The front tire found a pressure plate buried deep. The explosion lifted the world. The blast painted the sky with dust and shrapnel. She remembered the smell, cordite, burned rubber, blood. She remembered her legs refusing to move, her hands refusing to stop. Seatbelt, door latch, jammed, crowbar, leverage, then hands on a vest grip, a boot scraping asphalt. She didn't remember falling, only hearing her own voice shouting for a half-conscious driver to breathe. They credited the survival of the crew to quick response and luck. Ryan knew better. It was Emily's refusal to leave until the driver blinked twice and squeezed her wrist. That pressure, that faint human pulse, was the reason he still saw daylight. So when laughter rippled through the courtyard, something in Ryan went cold. The new SEALs carried reputations that arrived before they did, men of perfect records and classified missions. Their leader, Petty Officer Mark Davis, looked every inch the part. Squared uniform, controlled posture, the air of someone who'd seen too much and believed it granted him immunity from pettiness. But even discipline erodes under boredom. Maybe that's all it was, Ryan thought. Boredom. Still, the words had cut deep, and they'd hit their mark. Dana Reeves subtly altered her patrol route by a few meters, enough to catch faces, badges, and time of day. Her thumb brushed the switch on her body cam but didn't press it. She wasn't there to chase anyone. She was there to collect truth. Emily reached the medical tent, sat down quietly while a young PA peeled off the bandage, frowning. "You're walking too much," he said. "I had to," she replied with a faint smile. "The tent's too far away." "That's not funny. I only joke on days I'm still standing." He muttered something about stubbornness and heroism sharing the same skull. She just watched the tent flap sway in the wind. Heat seeped in and touched everything. She told no one what she'd heard outside. She didn't need pity. She didn't have time for anger. There were wounds to clean, forms to sign, and a dull ache in her bones that sang on the hour. On bases like this, information doesn't spread. It arrives pre-assembled. The insult traveled fast, losing nothing along the way. Someone swore they saw a reflection from a phone camera. Someone else repeated the words exactly. A mechanic marked the time because he'd been changing an oil filter. By evening, the deputy base commander had a folder she hadn't asked for and couldn't ignore. Lieutenant Colonel Janet Morales was not a woman who raised her voice unless she meant to. Tall, composed, with a memory that kept kindness and disrespect filed in the same cabinet, she glanced at the report before reading it. Audio clip, eyewitness notes, a photo with faces circled in red. Sometimes, the obvious still needs to be made obvious. "Get Commander Porter," she said quietly to her aide, "and Sergeant Reeves." Outside, the temperature had dropped a few degrees. Inside the yard, it stayed hot. They didn't start with anger. They started with facts. Dana gathered statements like a medic collects supplies, methodical, steady, precise. "Tell me exactly what you saw and when," she said. She separated opinions from observation. She didn't push. The truth came together anyway, clean and sharp, as if the courtyard itself wanted to speak. Ryan Brooks gave his account last after cooling his rage for an hour. "I heard, look at her, she can't even walk straight. Then, guess she's done playing soldier." Another voice said she ran from the blast when she got hurt. Those are the exact words. He added the coordinates, timestamp, and sun angle. Habit, details mattered. The photo wasn't perfect, faces blurred, one man half-turned, but Dana had enough. The body language told the rest. Crossed arms, tilted chin, the lean-in of mockery disguised as camaraderie. Commander James Porter arrived tight-jawed. SEAL commanders live in a paradox, sworn to unleash violence against enemies but never against their own. He'd led men through houses where every shadow pulsed like a heartbeat. He'd also written condolence letters that read like prayers. "What's the complaint?" he asked. "No complaint," Morales replied. "A violation, a stain I won't let spread." Porter looked at the names. He knew them all. Pride itched beneath his collar. "We'll handle this internally," he said. "We'll handle it properly, Commander," she replied. Their eyes locked. He nodded once. That evening in the mess hall, the SEAL team sat at a corner table. Their jokes were flat, their laughter cautious. Davis looked bored, too intelligent for a fight but too restless for peace. He noticed Ryan's stare and raised an eyebrow, half amused, half warning. Ryan didn't look away. "Something you need, Corporal?" Davis asked lightly. "Yeah," Ryan said, "respect." Davis grinned, the kind men use when they think they're untouchable. "You want to try that again. You mocked a wounded soldier in public." Silence spread across nearby tables. Someone stirred an empty cup just to fill the air. Then Dana entered, quiet but deliberate, like a professional stepping into traffic. Petty Officer Davis, she said evenly. You and your men will report to the command tent at 700, full dress uniform. Bring your integrity. The table shifted, chairs scraped. On one face pain flickered, on another shame. Davis set his fork down carefully as if it might break. We'll be there, he said. He was, and so were his men. The command tent felt bigger when it was full of consequences. Maps pinned with grease-stained markers. A whiteboard divided into 3 columns: action, responsible, time. The air conditioning coughed. Morale stood at the head of the table, Porter to her left, hands clasped behind his back. Gentlemen, Morales began, her voice firm but calm. Yesterday, several of you behaved in a manner unworthy of this uniform. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't harmless fun. It was disrespect toward a soldier who carries more scars than some of you have years in service. A man in the third row raised his hand. Ma'am, permission to speak. You'll have it, she said, pressing a button. The room filled with sound, the recorded laughter, the cruel line, the sharp sting of a second voice. No one moved. The generator hum outside felt louder. Someone's boot scraped gravel, then silence again. There are lines, Porter said quietly. You crossed the only one that matters. Davis tried to recover. Commander, with all due respect, we didn't know. You assumed weakness, Porter cut in someone who's bled for you. The words landed like weight. Morales looked around the room. If someone mocked your teammate, broken but still standing, would you laugh, look away, or would you correct it? She let silence answer. Silence spoke well. And still outside, the sun burned on. Inside, a lesson had begun. Sometimes the loudest sound on a base isn't an explosion. It's a voice that refuses to rise and still commands the room. Would you like me to continue with part 2? Another 1,500 plus words, directly from this point, covering the investigation, Emily's silent endurance, and the slow unraveling of the SEAL team's remorse. You said. 2. ChatGPT said. Perfect. Here is part 2, continuing seamlessly from the previous section. It stays cinematic, emotionally layered and voiceover ready, with packing that builds suspense and empathy. 1,600 words. She sat quietly under the dim canvas light, the smell of disinfectant and heat mixing with her thoughts. The medical tent buzzed with the low hum of machines and quiet urgency, the kind of stillness that happens only in places where pain is routine. Emily Carter never liked being a patient. She'd rather be the one holding the gauze, not the one wearing it. The physician assistant checked her vitals, frowned again, and told her she was pushing herself too hard. She smiled the way tired people do, a small curve of truth and defiance. I've been worse, she said softly. That's not the point, he replied. I know, she whispered, but the work doesn't stop just because I limp. Outside, voices carried through the thin walls. She ignored them. Paperwork waited. Wounds waited. 100 small duties that kept the mind from remembering things best forgotten. She didn't know what was happening in the command tent that same moment, how the conversation about her had become the quiet center of the base. She didn't know her name was written on a folder that now sat between a colonel and a SEAL commander, beneath a single word: integrity. At dawn, Morales's voice broke the desert silence. We hold our people accountable because no one else will. The room of men and women, soldiers, SEALs, MPs, medics felt suddenly smaller. Porter stood beside her, not as her superior but as an equal. There was no theater here, only consequence. Sergeant Dana Reeves read from her notes. Each statement, each timestamp, each angle of sun described by those who'd witnessed the laughter. Her tone was neutral, factual, but beneath it there was steel. When she finished, Morales closed her folder. This isn't about embarrassment. It's about the standard we choose to live by when no one's watching. Porter nodded. We've all been tired, we've all seen hell, but fatigue is not a license to forget humanity. No one spoke, even the air felt ashamed. Ryan Brooks stood outside afterward, sunlight bouncing off the comms tower. He thought about the convoy explosion again, about the voice that steadied him on the radio. Her voice, calm, clipped, with that steady rhythm that keeps panic from spreading. He remembered how it felt to hear it, how it made chaos shrink to a single breath. "One breath," she had said, "now speak." He wondered if those men had ever heard something like that, something that saves you before you even realize you're drowning. Dana stepped out behind him. She didn't need to ask what he was thinking. "She doesn't want a medal," Ryan said. "She just wants people to act right." "That's harder than bravery sometimes," Dana replied. "Bravery is a moment, decency is a habit." That evening the mess hall was quieter. The SEALs sat in the same corner but didn't laugh. Their leader, Davis, kept his eyes on his untouched tray. The noise of utensils and chatter seemed distant, cautious. Word had spread, not about punishment, about shame. When Ryan passed their table, no one spoke, not until Davis finally looked up. "She doesn't care about this, you know," he said. "She shouldn't have to," Ryan replied. "She doesn't even know my name. She shouldn't have to know that either." Davis exhaled, long and slow. "You think we're monsters?" Ryan shook his head. "No, I think you forgot what you swore to protect." And then he walked away. Sometimes redemption begins with silence, the space after the echo of your own mistake. The next morning, Emily returned for her follow-up. The PA, now gentler, told her she should stay off her leg for a week. She nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere, on inventory, on the med kits, on how order could still exist in a world that kept breaking itself. "You should rest," he insisted. "I will," she said, but even she didn't believe it. Outside, the base moved in its usual rhythm. The clank of tools, the shuffle of boots, the faint beat of a helicopter overhead. She felt all of it, every sound pressing against her skin. She thought about the men who'd laughed. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes energy, and she'd spent hers on survival. What lingered instead was something quieter, disappointment maybe, or understanding. Sometimes people mock what they fear becoming. She picked up a clipboard and went back to work. By afternoon, the base's grapevine had done its job. Everyone knew an inquiry was underway. Morales didn't tolerate disorder, and Porter didn't protect pride at the expense of integrity. Even the kitchen staff whispered about it. But the ones at the center, the SEALs, weren't defiant now. They were quiet, not because they'd been ordered to be, but because realization had weight. It presses on your ribs when you start to see yourself clearly. Dana Reeves called it the slow bend toward decency. She'd seen it before. It never came fast, but it came. That night, Morales sat in her office under a single lamp, reading Emily's personnel file. The edges were soft from use. She turned to the citation for the convoy rescue. The words were plain: displayed exceptional courage under fire, refused evacuation until all wounded were stable. No embellishment, no self-promotion, just duty. Morales closed the file and stared at the tent wall, the canvas flickering from a passing vehicle's headlights. "Sometimes," she murmured, "our quietest soldiers carry the heaviest truths." The hearing was scheduled for sunrise. Davis and his men stood at attention, uniforms immaculate, faces pale in the orange glow. Morales addressed them not as a prosecutor, but as a teacher who still hoped her students could learn. "Gentlemen," she began, "yesterday you failed to see a comrade's worth. Today you will have to look at her and yourselves without the armor of arrogance." She gestured toward the recording equipment. The laughter played again. The joke, the words that had cost them their pride. Porter's expression didn't change, but something in his jaw twitched. When the last echo faded, Morales asked, "Would you have laughed if you'd known what she carried? If you'd seen her crawl into a burning vehicle for men she'd barely met? or if you'd seen her hand stop another man's bleeding before he even screamed. No answer, only silence, the kind that feels like confession. Later that morning, Emily was in the med bay when Ryan arrived with the update. They held the hearing, he said quietly. Davis didn't deny it. She looked up from her paperwork. I wasn't expecting him to. They're going to face disciplinary action. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just paused. I hope they learned something from it. Ryan hesitated. You could attend, you know, they'll let you speak. I've said enough just by walking through that courtyard, she said, fastening her sleeve. Let the rest speak for itself. The base woke to a rare kind of stillness. People moved differently, slower, more aware. The SEALs had reported to duty but with lowered eyes. And somewhere in that shift, a kind of respect began to grow, not out of fear, but understanding. Sometimes change doesn't happen through orders. It happens when people finally feel the weight of what they ignored. That evening, Emily sat alone outside the tent, her crutch propped beside her, the horizon bleeding into gold and blue. The heat was fatting. The wind carried faint music from the mess hall. She closed her eyes and listened not to the melody but to the voices beneath it, softer now, gentler. She thought of all the things she'd seen, the medevacs, the desert nights, the faces that never made it home. She stopped asking why long ago. The better question she'd learned was how to keep walking, how to stay kind when the world forgets to be. In the distance, a chopper's blades blurred the sunset. It sounded like thunder fading away. Across the base, Morales and Porter stood watching the courtyard from her office window. You think they'll get it? He asked. They will, she said. One way or another, lessons like this, they stick. Shame's a slow teacher, but it's thorough. He nodded. She doesn't know we're doing this for her. She doesn't need to, Morales replied. That's what makes it right. As the day ended, Ryan saw Emily limping back from inventory duty, a clipboard tucked under her arm. She shouldn't have been out there, but he didn't stop her. There was something sacred about her quiet insistence. He thought of what Morales had said earlier. Respect isn't given, it's observed. He understood now. He was watching it walk right past him, step by step. That night, as the base lights dimmed and the desert cooled, a different kind of story began to take root. Not the kind told in medals or reports, but in the way people behaved when no one recorded them. A young private picked up trash that wasn't his. A mechanic paused to help a limping soldier with her pack. A SEAL, sitting alone, turned off his phone and stared at his hands for a long, long time. Emily didn't see any of it, but maybe she didn't need to. Some lessons bloom quietly, without witnesses, without applause. And somewhere inside that silence, the base exhaled. The dust settled. The laughter that once echoed off the courtyard walls faded into memory. Respect had returned, not shouted, not ordered, but chosen. What makes a soldier change? Not punishment, not orders. Sometimes it's the quiet moment after shame, when you see yourself reflected in someone you once overlooked. That morning the sun rose soft over the compound, washing the base in pale gold. The air felt different, lighter, though no one could explain why. Somewhere between the dust and the diesel, a quiet respect had begun to settle. Sergeant Emily Carter moved slower that day. Her leg ached, but she carried on, clipboard under arm, bandage hidden beneath her fatigues. She walked the rows of medical kits, checking expiration dates, marking replacements. It was the kind of work no one notices, the sort that keeps others alive without ever being seen. From across the tent, Ryan Brooks watched her in silence. She wasn't a hero in motion. She was something rarer, steady, unremarkable in the way a heartbeat is until it stops. When she finally noticed him watching, she raised an eyebrow. You need something, Corporal. He hesitated. They held the follow-up meeting this morning. Morales asked for statements. And Davis owned it, the others too. Emily nodded once. Good. That's it, good. What else should it be? She asked softly. They already know more than my anger could teach them. Ryan wanted to argue, to tell her she deserved to be angry, but she'd already turned back to her inventory list. The conversation was over, but the weight of it lingered. By midday, the hearing's outcome spread like desert fire. No one cheered, no one whispered loudly, respect isn't noisy. Still, every corridor seemed to carry a different kind of stillness, the kind that follows understanding. Morales's office door stayed open all day, not as a symbol but as a habit. She believed visibility was the best disinfectant. Dana Reeves brought her a stack of sign statements, each one brief, each one honest. Any excuses? Morales asked. None that mattered, Dana replied. Even Davis didn't hide behind protocol. Morales nodded. Good, now let's see what they do with guilt. Commander Porter found Davis that evening near the motor pool, staring at a Humvee with a fresh coat of dust. You know, Porter said, stepping beside him, I used to think discipline was about fear. Davis didn't answer. Porter looked out across the yard. It's not, it's about memory, remembering what you promised, who you promised it for. Davis's hands clenched and relaxed. I disrespected a wounded soldier. You disrespected a principal, Porter corrected, and she reminded you of it without saying a word. Davis finally looked at him. What happens now? You'll serve where humility lives, Porter said. Rehabilitation rotation. You'll work with the wounded. Davis blinked. That's not punishment. It's education, Porter said. You'll thank me later. That night, Emily sat alone outside the med tent, the desert air cooling around her. She traced the edge of her knee brace with her fingers. Pain was an old friend now, inconvenient, familiar. She thought about the laughter again. It didn't sting anymore. It had become something else, a reminder that silence, too, can speak. Inside, a young medic struggled with paperwork. Emily leaned in through the flap. You're mixing the order again, she said gently. The medic sighed. I don't get how you keep all this straight. By not trying to be perfect, Emily said, just consistent. The girl smiled faintly. Is that what you are, Sergeant, consistent? Emily laughed once, a sound small and real. That's all I've got left. The next morning, Ryan walked into the communications hub to find Dana Reeves standing over a table covered in reports. She looked up. You heard. About Davis. She nodded. They sent him to the rehab center, Morales's idea. Ryan smirked. She's smarter than all of us combined. Dana tilted her head. You think he'll learn something there? I think he already started learning, Ryan said. The hard way. Days passed. The rhythm of the bass returned, but something stayed different, subtle shifts in tone, in posture, in the way people spoke to each other. It was small but real. And then one afternoon, a call came over the radio. Medical emergency near Com's compound. Possible arterial bleed. Ryan dropped what he was doing. Emily was already halfway there, limping hard, her crutch abandoned. When he arrived, the scene was chaos. A young soldier down, blood seeping fast from a deep arm wound. Davis knelt beside him, hands covered in crimson, trying to apply a tourniquet with trembling fingers. Pressure, Emily's voice cut through the noise like a commandment. She dropped beside them, calm, measured, her movements fluid despite the pain in her leg. Higher, she said, guiding Davis's hand. Tighten, now hold. Her eyes flicked to the soldier. Stay with me, Private, look at me. What's your name? He whispered it once, then again. Good, she said softly. That's all you need to do, just keep talking. Ryan arrived with bandages. Got it, he said, passing one over. Keep him talking, Emily murmured. No one panics when they're busy answering questions. Davis followed every instruction, his face pale but steady. For once he didn't speak, he just listened. Within minutes the bleeding slowed, the soldier's breathing evened. Vitals, Emily asked. Strong, Ryan said. Good. She finally looked at Davis. His hands shook, not from fear, from realization. Sergeant, he began, but she cut him off gently. Get some water, she said. You're pale. It was mercy disguised as humor. He nodded, stood, and for a long time he didn't move, just looked at her. The woman he'd mocked was now the reason a man was alive. He'd never forget that. That night the mess hall was quiet again. Davis sat alone at one end, untouched food before him. Ryan joined him without a word. She saved him, Davis said after a long silence. Ryan nodded. That's what she does. I should have known, Davis whispered. The limp, the scar, I saw weakness. She saw work that needed doing. Ryan looked at him. You can still make it right. Davis shook his head. You can't undo disrespect. You can only stop repeating it. Then start there. Davis exhaled, a sound half laugh, half surrender. You sound like her. Ryan smiled. She rubs off on people. Meanwhile, Morales reviewed the final reports. Her pen hovered over the disciplinary forms, but she hesitated. Dana noticed. You're not changing the sentence, are you? No, Morales said, just reflecting. On what? On how one person's dignity can change the culture of an entire base. Dana leaned back, arms crossed. We always talk about leadership training. Turns out it looks like a wounded medic who won't complain. Morales smiled faintly. Maybe that's what real command looks like, walking through pain and still leaving order behind. Weeks passed. The base moved on. The laughter that once stained the courtyard faded into memory, replaced by something steadier, unspoken accountability. Davis began his rotation at the rehabilitation center. His first day, the nurse looked unimpressed. You can start by restocking supplies, she said. He did quietly, without question. He spent the next few weeks watching soldiers relearn how to move, how to stand, how to live in bodies that didn't cooperate anymore. Some had lost limbs, others carried burns or tremors, but all of them carried grace. It humbled him. He sat one day beside a double amputee learning to use prosthetics. The man fell twice, cursed once, then laughed. You SEALs think you're tough, he said. Try walking when the floor feels like memory. Davis smiled faintly. I'm trying. Good, the man said. Try quieter. He did. Back on base, Emily's leg healed slowly. She moved with less of a limp now, though the ache never fully left. She taught new medics how to think under pressure, how to find calm inside chaos. Adrenaline lies to you, she told them. It tells you to go faster. Most of the time, slower is safer. Breathe, then act. The recruits listened, not because of her rank, but because her tone carried something stronger than authority. It carried proof. Ryan, now promoted to sergeant, ran drills with the same calm cadence he'd once borrowed from her voice. Dana took 2 new MPs under her wing, teaching them that truth without empathy was just noise. And Morales. She started rewriting sections of the base's cultural code, quiet reforms no one would read but everyone would feel. One evening, as the desert sky burned orange, Porter approached Morales outside her office. You ever think about what caused all this? He asked. She smiled, a few careless words. And one woman who refused to answer them, he said. They both stood there in silence, watching soldiers move through the courtyard, not rushing, not posturing, just walking, purposeful, respectful. That's how change looks, Morales murmured, not in speeches, in posture. Later that night, Emily sat by her cot, writing a note to her replacement medic. Her handwriting was small, precise. Always check the expiration dates twice. Keep extra morphine syringes hidden in the 3rd drawer. And remember, sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is stay calm when everyone else is. She folded the note neatly and slipped it into a folder. Then she looked at her bandaged knee, at the scar that still traced her cheek. Maybe pain doesn't fade because it's not meant to. Maybe it stays as a reminder that strength isn't what survives the fire, but what walks through it quietly afterward. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying sand across the same courtyard where it had all begun. The same ground that had once echoed with laughter now held something sacred. Silence, the kind that comes after learning. What makes redemption real? Not words, not apologies spoken for the sake of peace. Redemption only begins when silence starts to work differently inside you, when every quiet second becomes a mirror. Weeks had passed since the courtyard incident. The days bled together in a steady rhythm of heat, duty, and reflection. The base had found a new kind of order, not the kind enforced by rank, but by awareness. Everyone moved a little softer, spoke a little lower. Even the laughter, when it came, carried a certain respect. Petty Officer Mark Davis arrived at the rehabilitation center before dawn. The desert outside was still blue, the kind of color that hides mistakes. He wore no insignia on his chest now, just a plain uniform. The nurse at the front desk didn't salute. She nodded once, businesslike. "You're early," she said. "Habit," he replied. "Good, we like habits here, especially the useful ones." She handed him a clipboard and pointed toward a hallway lined with open doors. Inside each room, the slow sounds of recovery, metal crutches scraping, therapists counting aloud, soft grunts of effort, and somewhere, faint laughter that sounded half defiant, half tired. Davis hesitated before stepping in. For years, he'd been trained to move fast, strike first, act without hesitation. This was different. Here, the mission was patience. His first task was simple: fill water jugs, check oxygen tanks, wipe down equipment. He did it quietly, careful not to disturb anyone. Halfway through the morning, he saw a young corporal attempting to stand, one prosthetic leg slipping on the mat. A physical therapist reached to help, but the soldier waved her off stubbornly. "I got it," the man said through gritted teeth. Davis watched him sway, then catch himself. Sweat poured down his face. When he finally sank back onto the bench, exhausted, Davis knelt beside him. "Hell of a workout," he said softly. The corporal smirked weakly. "You SEALs think you're tough. Try learning to walk again." Davis smiled faintly. "That's why I'm here." "To walk." "To learn," he said. The soldier studied him, then nodded once. "Good, start by listening." And Davis did. Each day followed a rhythm that humbled him further. He learned how pain rewrites the human schedule, how small victories, lifting a cup, buttoning a shirt, felt bigger than medals. He learned that courage didn't look like charging through doors. It looked like standing, falling, and standing again. One afternoon, he helped an older sergeant with burned scars stretch his fingers. The man flinched with every movement. Davis kept his tone steady. "You're doing fine. One more." The man hissed in pain. "You ever been on fire, sailor?" "No," Davis said quietly, "but I lit enough to understand what it does." The man looked at him, something passing in his eyes, understanding, maybe respect. "Then keep talking," he said. "It helps." At night, Davis wrote notes to himself. Small things, fragments. Apologies are useless unless they cost you something. Respect isn't learned, it's remembered. Weakness doesn't look how we think it does. He didn't send any of them. He didn't know if he ever would. Back on base, Emily Carter was walking again without the crutch. The limp remained, but it had softened, more rhythm than flaw now. Her presence, as always, changed the temperature of a room. She didn't need to command attention. Silence did it for her. She trained the new medics with a patience that bordered on spiritual. She showed them how to steady their breathing before cutting away a uniform, how to hold pressure without trembling, how to speak in short sentences that keep people alive. "You don't control chaos," she said. "You make it listen to you for just a few seconds. That's all you need." They believed her, Everyone did. That afternoon, Ryan Brooks visited her in the med tent. He had something in his hand, a small, folded note. "What's that?" she asked. He hesitated. "Letter from Davis, unsent, but Morales thought you should see it." Emily took it carefully, reading each line in silence. The words were raw, unpolished, almost hesitant. "I said something I can't unsay. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I've seen the cost of arrogance now up close. I don't want forgiveness. I want to understand." She folded the letter again and handed it back. "He doesn't need my forgiveness," she said softly. "He needs to keep learning." Ryan nodded. "He's doing that." "I know." "How?" "Because you're telling me instead of defending him," she said with a small smile. Ryan chuckled. "You're impossible to surprise." "Good," she said. "That's the only kind of soldier worth being." Meanwhile, in Morales's office, the colonel reviewed progress reports from the rehabilitation center. She traced her finger over the line that listed Davis's name. Next to it, performance, exemplary, attitude, reflective. She smiled faintly. "He's getting it." Dana Reeves, standing nearby, raised an eyebrow. "You sound almost proud." Morales shrugged. "Of the system working, always; of him, maybe a little." "Do you think Carter knows she caused all this change?" Dana asked. Morales closed the file. "She doesn't need to. That's what makes it real." Davis's transformation didn't happen in a single revelation. It came slowly, one wound at a time. He spent afternoons helping patients with exercises, then stayed late to clean up. He listened more than he spoke. The man who once led missions now fetched wheelchairs, folded towels, and carried stories he couldn't forget. One evening, the nurse approached him with a clipboard. "We're short on staff tomorrow. You mind sitting with a patient overnight?" "Not at all," he said. The patient was a young woman, no older than 22, with shrapnel scars along her arm and a bandage across her eye. She was quiet, restless in her sleep. Around 2 a.m., she woke with a gasp. "Easy," Davis said softly. "You're safe, you're here." Her breathing steadied, but tears slipped down her cheek. "I hate this place," she whispered. "I hate being broken." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're not broken," he said. "You're rebuilding." She looked at him skeptically. "You really believe that?" He nodded. "I used to think strength was noise. Now I know it's endurance." The girl closed her eyes again, and for the first time since arriving, she slept. When morning came, Davis stayed a few minutes longer, just watching the sunlight move across the floor. It felt like clarity. Back on base, Ryan received a message from Morales. Reintegration request approved. Davis was coming back. When Emily heard, she said nothing, just kept working. The base had changed since the day of the incident, but now it was about to be tested again. Davis returned 2 weeks later. The base looked the same dust, same hum of engines, but it felt different. People greeted him with nods instead of glances, respectful, distant. He didn't blame them. He walked straight to the med tent. Emily was there cleaning instruments. When she looked up, he froze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Emily said quietly, "You look healthier." "I feel different," Davis said. "Good." He hesitated. "I wanted to say." She stopped him gently. Not yet, let your actions speak first." He nodded slowly, understood. And that was enough. Over the following days, Davis volunteered anywhere that needed him. Supply lines, medical support, logistics. He never asked for recognition. He didn't avoid Emily, but he didn't approach her either. He simply worked, steadily, humbly, like a man learning a new language. People noticed. Ryan did. Dana did. Even Morales, watching from her office window, said to Porter, "He's starting to walk like he belongs again." Porter nodded. "That's how you know a soldier's healed, not when he stops limping, but when he walks without shame." That night the courtyard glowed under floodlights. Emily crossed it slowly, her limp faint now, her pace steady. Ahead, she saw Davis kneeling beside a Humvee, tightening a bolt. He looked up, surprised. "Evening, Sergeant," he said. She nodded, "Evening." They stood in silence for a while, engines humming in the background. Finally, Emily spoke. "You've changed." "Trying to," Davis said. "Not sure if it shows." "It does." He looked at her then, really looked. "You know, that day in the courtyard, I thought you were fragile." Emily smiled faintly. "And now?" He took a deep breath. "Now I know you were carrying all of us." She didn't respond, didn't smile. She just nodded once and turned away, limping toward the med tent. Davis watched her go, the air thick with a respect that words couldn't hold. Later that week, Morales gathered her officers for a review. The courtyard incident was officially closed, but the lesson remained open, written not on paper but in people. Culture, Morales said, isn't changed by rules. It's changed by example, and the best ones don't need to speak. That night, as the base settled into quiet, Emily wrote her last note before lights out. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout, it just continues. She placed the notebook beside her cot and turned off the lamp. Outside, the desert wind carried the faint hum of engines, and something softer beneath it, peace. Not perfect, not permanent, but earned. How do you forgive someone who wounded your dignity, not with bullets, but with words? Maybe you don't. Maybe forgiveness isn't something you give at all. Maybe it's something you live quietly, day after day, until the wound stops speaking louder than you do. The base looked ordinary again, but anyone who'd been there before could feel the change. You could hear it in the rhythm of boots on the concrete, fewer stomps, more purpose. You could see it in the way soldiers nodded when they passed the med tent. Respect had become muscle memory. Sergeant Emily Carter walked through the same courtyard that had once echoed with mockery. Her limp had softened into something steady, almost rhythmic, the sound of endurance. She wasn't proud of that day. She wasn't bitter either. She'd simply folded it into the fabric of her life, the way a scar becomes part of your reflection. Inside the med tent, the air smelled of iodine and metal. Rows of recruits moved through triage drills. Their hands trembled the way hers once had. "Pressure first, panic second," she said calmly. "The blood's faster than your thoughts, keep up with it, then get ahead." A private pressed too lightly. Emily took his hand, tightened it. "There, now you're saving someone." He nodded, sweating. "Yes, Sergeant." Her tone never rose, but every ear in the tent listened. That's what leadership sounded like when it didn't need to shout. Later that afternoon, Commander Porter found her sitting outside, rolling her left knee with slow precision. "Still giving the new medics hell?" he asked. She smiled. "They're learning, that's enough." Porter leaned against a support beam. "You know, Carter, when this base talks about resilience, they're not quoting policy manuals. They're talking about you." Emily shook her head. "They're talking about what they learned from the courtyard, not me." He studied her face, the scar that caught the light, the calm behind her eyes. "Still, I'm glad they learned it while you were here to see it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't need to see it, sir. I just needed to believe it was possible." At the same hour, miles away at the rehab center, Davis sat by the window with a notebook balanced on his knee. His handwriting had changed, slower, cleaner, deliberate. He'd been there for weeks now, helping others heal, but it was himself he was quietly rebuilding. Across the room, a man with one arm was laughing with his therapist. The sound made Davis smile. He picked up his pen and began to write. Not an apology this time, a confession. "Sergeant Carter, you told me not to speak until my actions did. I've been trying to let them, but silence isn't the same as understanding. I used to think strength was the noise a man makes when the fight begins. Now I know it's the silence he keeps when it ends. Every patient here teaches me something. None of them brag, none of them quit. I see you in them in the way they keep moving. If this letter never reaches you, that's fine. It was meant to be written, not delivered. Respectfully, Mark Davis. He didn't send it, not yet, but this time he didn't throw it away either. Back on base, the wind had changed. A cooler season was beginning to creep across the desert. Morale stood with Dana Reeves outside the operations tent, both watching a group of recruits running laps. You ever notice, Morale said, how every generation needs to relearn the same lessons? Dana nodded. Yeah, but maybe that's the point, to keep remembering what decency costs. Do you think Carter knows she's the reason Morale's higher? Morales asked. She knows, Dana said. She just doesn't need to hear it. That evening, Ryan Brooks stopped by the med tent with a stack of new comm reports. Delivery, he said, setting them down. Emily looked up. You could have sent these with a runner. Yeah, he said, but runners don't usually check if the medic's eaten dinner. She smirked. You turning soft, Sergeant Brooks. Blame you, he said. You make silence look productive. They shared a laugh, quiet and genuine. Then Ryan grew thoughtful. I heard Davis might be coming back soon. Morales thinks he's ready. Emily didn't look up from her paperwork. Ready for what? To face this place again. She paused, then said, facing yourself is the hard part. The rest is just geography. Ryan nodded slowly. You ever gonna talk to him? Maybe, she said, when there's something left to say. The next morning, Morales called a formation in the courtyard, the same place where it had all started. Soldiers lined up under the early sun, medics, engineers, MPs, SEALs. When Emily arrived, she stayed near the back, not out of modesty but comfort. She liked to observe. Morales stepped forward. This base has seen plenty of missions, she said. But the hardest one is the one we fight inside ourselves, the battle between pride and humility. I don't need to tell you who reminded us of that. You already know. Heads turned slightly toward Emily. She stared straight ahead, hands clasped behind her back. This isn't a ceremony, Morales continued. It's a reminder. Every uniform represents more than strength. It represents restraint, the choice to act right when no one's watching. She let the silence hang for a moment. That's all. And just like that, the formation dispersed. No applause, no medals, no speeches. Only understanding. That's how real respect sounds. Not in clapping hands, but in quiet posture. Later, Emily walked across the courtyard again. The same ground, the same sunlight. But this time, no one laughed. 2 new SEALs stood to the side, both fresh from deployment. They noticed her limp and instinctively straightened. They didn't salute, it wasn't the place for that. They just nodded and stepped aside, giving her space. She returned the nod. That was enough. That night, Davis finished his last shift at the rehab center. Before leaving, he stopped at the nurse's desk. Thank you, he said. For what, she asked. For teaching me the part of service they don't cover in training. She smiled. You learned it because someone already lived it in front of you. He didn't argue. He knew she was right. He folded his unsent letter into his breast pocket and walked out into the night. When he returned to the base, everything looked smaller, or maybe he'd just learned to see more clearly. He made his way to the med tent again. Emily was alone, labeling supplies. He waited by the entrance until she looked up. Evening, she said. Evening, he replied. She studied him for a long moment. You came back different. I had good teachers, he said. She nodded toward the letter in his hand. That for me. He hesitated, then handed it over. Only if you want it. She unfolded it slowly, reading each line. When she finished, she didn't speak right away. Then she said quietly, You're harder on yourself than I ever could be. I deserve it. Maybe, she said, but guilt's a poor substitute for growth. He swallowed. I'm not looking for forgiveness. I know, she said. That's why you might deserve it." The words hung there, warm and heavy. He nodded once, then saluted her not by regulation but by instinct. She returned it, slow and deliberate. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something deeper. Understanding. Outside, the sky was turning violet. The base lights flickered on one by one, glowing like quiet sentinels. Morales watched from her window. "You ever notice," she said to Dana, who stood beside her, "how one person's decency can echo louder than a whole chain of command?" Dana smiled. "Yeah, but you need ears ready to listen." That night, Emily sat by her cot, the soft hum of a generator in the distance. She reached for her worn notebook and wrote, "Forgiveness isn't something you give. It's something you live until it no longer hurts to remember." She closed the notebook and lay back. Outside, the desert wind moved like a slow tide across the compound, steady, unbroken, alive. The next morning, Davis reported for duty. Not as a SEAL leader this time, but as part of the base's rehabilitation liaison. His first assignment: assist with patient transport and medical coordination. When he stepped into the med tent, Emily was already there, giving orders to the new recruits. He didn't interrupt, he simply waited for her to finish. When she finally turned, she nodded toward the stretcher beside him. "You know how to handle that?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Good," she said, "then welcome back." No ceremony, no redemption speech, just purpose restored, simple, earned. And so the rhythm of the base continued, the same engines, the same dust, but now threaded with something that hadn't been there before. Grace. It moved through the corridors quietly in gestures no one recorded. A door held open, a tool handed over, a silence respected. For once the base didn't need a hero. It had learned something rarer: humility. And the woman who taught it all walked the same ground every day, her limp now barely noticeable, her voice steady, her dignity unbroken. Because sometimes the greatest act of forgiveness is simply continuing, stronger, quieter, and unwilling to forget what it cost to stay kind. Would you like me to continue with part 6, where Davis begins mentoring new recruits under Emily's guidance, and the story evolves toward its reflective climax, about leadership, legacy, and what strength truly means once the battle ends? You said. 6. ChatGPT said. Perfect. Here is part 6, continuing seamlessly from where part 5 left off. It deepens the themes of mentorship, legacy, and quiet strength, cinematic, emotionally grounded, and perfectly paced for narration, till the 1,600 plus words. What does strength look like after war stops echoing? Not medals, not orders barked across a parade ground. Real strength looks like patience, the kind that rebuilds others quietly, without asking for applause. By the time autumn winds swept across the base, both Emily and Davis had settled into a rhythm neither expected. She trained medics. He managed logistics and recovery coordination, a far cry from covert missions and breach points. But somehow, both of them seemed more alive here than they ever had in combat. Davis had changed. His movements were slower now, more deliberate. The same precision that once guided him through raids now guided him through small mercies, checking vitals, loading supplies, helping a limping soldier into a jeep. People started calling him Doc Seal, half in jest, half in respect. He didn't correct them. He just smiled and kept working. One morning, Morales and Porter watched the two from a distance. Emily explaining a triage technique, Davis lifting a stretcher without a word. "You ever think," Morales said quietly, "that redemption and leadership might be the same thing, just seen from opposite ends?" Porter folded his arms. "He leads better now that he's not trying to impress anyone, and she commands even when she says nothing." Morales nodded. Command by example, the hardest kind. Inside the med tent, the new recruits were restless. Their drills had grown repetitive and some were getting sloppy. Emily noticed she always did. "Reset," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're not just treating wounds. You're buying seconds between life and death. If that doesn't scare you, you're not paying attention." Davis stood in the back, arms crossed, observing. When she paused, he stepped forward. "She's right," he said. "You want to know what happens when seconds are wasted." The recruits turned toward him. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight in it made the air still. "People die before you get there, or they live because you didn't freeze. That's the choice. No one will thank you for it, but they'll still be breathing because of it." The room went silent. Emily gave him a brief nod, not of approval, but of understanding. After the session, she found him outside refilling a canteen. "You talk like someone who's finally listening to himself," she said. He looked up. "I used to think my job was to act. Now I know it's to notice." "That's the difference between noise and awareness," she said softly. As the days shortened, the tone of the bass softened with them. Routine returned, but something lingered, a shared humility that made people slower to judge, quicker to help. In the dining hall, soldiers sat mixed by rank and role, medics beside engineers, MPs beside pilots. There were no segregated corners anymore, no unspoken hierarchies. Morales noticed and said nothing. She didn't need to. The culture had corrected itself quietly, naturally. One night, Emily walked out to the airfield after hours. The wind had turned cold. She leaned against a railing, watching the faint glow of runway lights stretch toward the horizon. Ryan found her there, coffee in hand. "You planning to take off, Sergeant?" She smiled, "Just making sure someone's watching the sky." He handed her the cup. "You ever think about leaving, transferring? You've earned easier duty." She took a sip. "I think about it, but then I remember there's still work to do here, still people learning." "Yeah," Ryan said. "You and Davis turned this place around." She looked at him sideways. "We just reminded them what decency looks like." He nodded slowly. "Funny thing is, that's harder to teach than tactics." The next morning, Davis began a new initiative Morales approved, Operation Echo. A mentorship program pairing experienced personnel with recruits to teach not just procedure, but perspective. "Every soldier has two missions," Davis told them. "The one they're given and the one life gives back." Emily was skeptical at first. "You think mentorship changes behavior?" she asked. Davis shrugged. "It changed mine." She didn't argue. Instead, she showed up to the first session unannounced. He spoke to the room of recruits, not as a commander, but as someone who'd fallen and stood back up. "You'll learn how to shoot, patch wounds, fix engines," he said. "But none of it matters if you forget the person next to you isn't disposable. If you ever think you're better than the wounded, you've already failed the mission." His voice didn't waver. No dramatics, no self-pity, just truth. When it ended, Emily approached him quietly. "You're finally teaching the thing they can't put in manuals," she said. "What's that?" "Respect," she said. "The kind that lasts longer than orders." That evening, Morales hosted a small briefing for senior staff. On the agenda, morale improvement. The reports were brief but unanimous. The base's culture was the healthiest it had been in years. She closed the folder, looked up and said, "Then we keep doing what works. No slogans, no speeches, just example." Porter smirked. "I'd say that's Carter's philosophy." "It's everyone's now," Morales said. Weeks passed. The cold deepened. The desert nights grew sharp and quiet. Emily's limp had become nearly invisible, but the ache never fully left. She didn't mind. It was a reminder not of pain, but of purpose. Sometimes, she thought, scars are just stories the skin remembers when the heart tries to forget. She sat one evening writing in her notebook, a habit now. Small reflections, not reports. Don't rush to prove you're strong. Just refuse to be anything else. Respect isn't loud, it's steady. Strength is patience in uniform. Davis found her there, sitting outside under the canopy light. "Still writing philosophy," he teased. "Just reminders," she said. "For you. For whoever comes after." He smiled faintly. "That's the thing about legacies. You never know who's watching you build them." She looked at him, then closed the notebook. "I don't need to know," she said. "I just need to keep building." The next day, a transport convoy arrived, new recruits, fresh uniforms, eager faces. Among them was a young woman barely 20, clutching her medical kit like a lifeline. Her name was Private Leela Torres, nervous, determined, the kind of energy Emily recognized instantly. "First assignment?" Emily asked her. "Yes, Sergeant," Leela said, voice trembling slightly. Emily smiled. "Good, you'll make mistakes, just make them fast and learn faster." Torres nodded. "I read about you," she said suddenly, "the courtyard thing." Emily's eyes softened. "Forget what you read. Just watch how people treat each other now. That's the real story." Over the next few weeks, Leela became her shadow, watching how Emily handled everything from drills to silence. She saw how Emily never raised her voice, never rushed an explanation, never made her rank feel like distance. Davis noticed too. "You've got a prodigy," he said one afternoon. "She's got potential," Emily replied, "but potential's just noise without humility." Davis smirked. "You sound like Morales." "Good," Emily said. "Someone has to." One afternoon, a field exercise went wrong. A simulated explosion caused panic among recruits. Someone froze, someone cried out, and for a moment it felt too real. Leela was the first to move. Her hands shook, but she followed everything Emily had taught her. Pressure first, calm second, voice steady. "Stay with me," she told the injured role player, just as Emily had once said in a burning convoy. When it was over, Emily approached her quietly. "You remembered," she said. Leela nodded, eyes wet. "I just heard your voice in my head." Emily smiled faintly. "Good, then I've done my job." That night, Davis found her sitting on the edge of the courtyard, same spot as months ago. "You know," he said softly, "you turned the place that broke you into a classroom." She looked at him. "It didn't break me. It revealed what needed fixing." He nodded. "You think this base will remember us?" "Not by name," she said, "but by tone." He laughed quietly. "Tone." "Yeah," she said, "the way people speak after they've learned what respect costs." Later, Morales wrote a small entry in her command log, just a single line. "Change achieved through silence and example. Maintain the standard." No one would ever read it outside her office, but that was fine. True change rarely needs an audience. When dawn came the next morning, Emily stood outside the med tent watching the sky lighten. Leela stood beside her, quiet. "Looks peaceful," Leela said. "It is," Emily replied. "For now, but peace is just another word for preparation." "For what?" "For the next person who needs you to stand still while they fall apart." Leela looked at her with wide eyes. "How do you do that, stay so calm?" Emily smiled. "Because once someone laughed when I couldn't walk straight, and I learned that dignity doesn't need to defend itself. It just keeps walking." The young medic nodded slowly, memorizing every word. And somewhere between the wind, the hum of engines, and the slow, steady footsteps of people who'd learned better, the base lived on. No monuments, no slogans, just the quiet rhythm of soldiers who understood that the truest victories happen long after the fight ends. Because strength doesn't retire. It teaches. It endures. It repeats itself in the next generation, until kindness becomes instinct. What happens when the mission finally ends? When the noise fades, the uniforms fray, and the medals start to rust. Maybe the real test of a soldier isn't surviving the battle, it's staying human after it. The desert had grown cooler. The nights came earlier, softer, as if even the wind was tired. Sergeant Emily Carter walked the perimeter in slow rhythm, her shadow long under the floodlights. It was supposed to be her last month on base. The transfer orders were signed. She would take an instructor role at the military academy, safer work, less dust, fewer ghosts. But the thought of leaving this place, the yard, the med tent, the people, felt like trying to walk away from a heartbeat that wasn't just hers anymore. She paused near the same stretch of concrete where it had all started, the same courtyard, the one that had once echoed with laughter and later with silence. Now it was just quiet, the good kind, the kind she'd fought for without knowing it. Inside the med tent, Private Leela Torres was finishing her last training evaluation. Davis stood beside her, clipboard in hand. "She's ready," he said when Emily entered. "You built another one like you." Leela flushed. "I'll never be like Sergeant Carter." Emily smiled. "Good, be better, that's the point." She handed Leela her final certification form. "You've earned this, but don't mistake it for an ending. It's just permission to keep learning." "Yes, Sergeant," Leela said quietly. When the young medic left, Davis lingered. "So, you really leaving?" "I'm transferring," she corrected. "Leaving, too permanent a word." He nodded, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Feels like the end of something." "It's not," she said. "It's a continuation, just quieter." Later that evening, Morales found Emily packing her desk, neatly, precisely like everything she did. "You know," Morales said softly, "I still get reports about you. They always start with the same phrase. Sergeant Carter said." Emily smiled faintly. "Then they're already thinking for themselves." Morales leaned on the doorframe. "You rebuilt a culture. I'm not sure even headquarters realizes how deep that runs." Emily closed a drawer. "I didn't rebuild anything. The people did. I just held space long enough for them to remember who they were." "That's command," Morales said. Emily shook her head. "That's memory." The next day, Davis walked into Morales's office carrying a small, sealed envelope. "For Carter," he said, "but I'd rather you deliver it after she's gone." Morales studied him. "Another apology." He shook his head. "A thank you and a confession." That night the base gathered for a small farewell in the mess hall. Nothing formal, Morales had insisted on that. The soldiers brought coffee, not champagne. They didn't line up for speeches. They just filled the room with quiet presence. Ryan was there. Dana too. Even Davis, leaning against a pillar, hands folded. When Emily entered, conversation softened into a respectful hush. She looked uncomfortable, as she always did when attention found her. Morales stood, lifted her cup. No speeches, just gratitude for service, for example, for silence that taught louder than words ever could. Then she sat down. It was perfect, brief, dignified, real. Emily took a breath and said, "You don't have to thank me, just keep the standard, that's all." And that was the closest thing to a farewell she would allow. Afterward, Davis found her outside, where the floodlights faded into the desert. "You hate goodbyes," he said. "They're just pauses," she replied. "Life keeps moving, so do we." He nodded slowly. "I wrote you another letter." "I figured," she said. He handed it to her. "You can read it later or never." She took it, folded it once, and tucked it into her pocket. "You've learned to say enough with fewer words." He smiled faintly. "You taught me that." When morning came, Emily's duffel sat by the transport truck. The engine idled, ready to take her toward a new post. Ryan shook her hand, trying to mask the emotion in his voice. "You left the place better than you found it." "That's all any of us can do," she said. Dana hugged her, quick, professional, but real. "For what it's worth, I kept the footage, the one from the courtyard, not to use, just to remember what changed us." Emily nodded. "Then keep it safe." She turned to Morales last. "You don't need me anymore." Morales smiled. "No, Sergeant, we need more of you." As the truck pulled away, the base watched in silence. No cheers, no salutes, just respect. And somewhere between the dust clouds and the horizon, Emily Carter disappeared into sunlight. Weeks passed. The base adjusted. The med tent carried on under Leela's supervision, Davis advising from logistics, Ryan managing comms. The rhythm held proof that true leadership doesn't leave when a leader does. One evening, Morales found an envelope on her desk. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, SFC Carter. She opened it carefully. Inside was Davis's letter. Ma'am, I've spent my entire career thinking leadership was about control, about being the loudest in the room. Carter showed me it's the opposite. It's about steadiness, about silence that steadies others. I can't undo what I did, but I can live differently because of it. If anyone asks what I learned, tell them this. The wounded aren't weak. They're mirrors. They show you who you really are. Respectfully, Mark Davis. Morales read it twice, folded it once, and placed it in Emily's personnel file. That's where it belongs, she murmured. Months later, at the military academy, Emily Carter stood in front of a new class of recruits, all fresh faces, all full of noise. She waited until the room quieted. Then she said, "You're here to learn how to survive war. I'm here to teach you how to live through it." Someone in the back raised a hand. "Ma'am, what's the most important thing you've learned in uniform?" Emily paused, thinking of the desert, the courtyard, the laughter that turned to silence. She said simply, "That strength isn't what you show when people are watching. It's what you do when they are." The class fell silent, not out of discipline but understanding. Back on the base, life continued. Morales promoted Ryan. Dana transferred to train new MPs. Leela ran the med tent with steady confidence. Davis stayed on not out of guilt but purpose. Sometimes he caught himself walking across the courtyard at dusk. The same place where he'd once laughed. Now every time his boots hit the ground, it felt like a quiet apology, one he'd keep making as long as he served. He stopped chasing redemption. He was living it. One night, Morales passed through the courtyard and saw him sitting on the low wall, looking up at the stars. "Still here, Davis?" she asked. "Somewhere between the past and what comes next," he said. She sat beside him. "You think she'll ever come back?" He smiled. "She never left, not really. You can still feel her in how people act." Morales nodded. "Then she did her job." He glanced at her. "No, she did more than that. She changed how we define strength." Months later, a small brown envelope arrived at the base, addressed simply to Commander Morales and staff. Inside, a single page in Emily's familiar handwriting. "How's the courtyard? Still standing? Good, keep it clean. Remember, respect isn't maintenance, it's movement. Keep moving." At the bottom, she'd signed just one initial, E. Morales pinned the letter to the bulletin board where everyone could see it. No announcement, no caption, just the letter itself. And for days afterward, soldiers stopped to read it, then walked away a little straighter, a little quieter, a little more aware. Because the base wasn't just a place anymore. It was a lesson, one learned in dust, in heat, in silence, in grace. And in the echo of footsteps that would keep walking long after Emily Carter was gone. What happens after heroes walk away? After the cameras fade, after the uniforms hang in closets, after silence becomes the only sound that feels honest. Maybe what's left isn't glory. Maybe it's something better, the quiet proof that dignity never needed an audience. A year passed. The base changed again, new recruits, new walls, fresh paint over old scars. But the foundation, that was the same. Every stone, every corridor still carried the rhythm of people who'd once learned the hard way what respect really means. The courtyard stood silent most days, except when boots crossed it during drills. No laughter anymore, just a hum of calm focus. The sunlight fell across the concrete like memory itself. On the eastern wall, a small plaque had been added. It wasn't official. No ceremony, no mention in records. Just a simple engraving, placed there by someone who'd known. For the ones who taught without shouting. No name. No rank. But everyone knew who it was for. Mark Davis stood before it one evening, hands in his pockets, the wind pulling at his sleeves. The sunset painted everything gold, even the gray lines in his hair. He hadn't written a letter in months, didn't need to anymore. His work spoke enough. Since Carter's departure, he'd led Operation Echo into its second phase, pairing mentors with every new arrival. The initiative spread beyond their base, reaching other units, other corners of command. What started as her silence had become a system. Still, some nights he came here, to remember to think. He looked at the plaque and said softly, "You'd hate this, Carter, too sentimental." Then he smiled, "But you'd understand why we did it." He stood there until the light faded, until the sound of engines in the distance reminded him it was time to move. At the academy hundreds of miles away, Emily Carter's life had settled into a slower rhythm. She walked without the limp now, or maybe she just learned to move with it so naturally that no one noticed. Her students adored her. Not because she told war stories, she rarely did, but because every lesson felt like truth carved from experience. One afternoon during a leadership lecture, a cadet raised his hand. "Ma'am," he asked, "what's the difference between authority and respect?" Emily paused, letting the silence stretch long enough for curiosity to build. "Authority is given," she said finally. "Respect is earned. Authority ends when the uniform comes off. Respect stays." The class was silent. She smiled slightly, the kind that carries years inside it. That night, she sat alone in her quarters, light from a single desk lamp falling over her notebook. She hadn't written in weeks. Now she opened to a blank page and began slowly. "I used to think silence was weakness. That speaking out was the only way to be heard. But silence, when it's steady, when it's patient, that's not weakness. That's command in its truest form." She looked out the window. The moonlight fell across her hands, scarred and strong. "They learned," she wrote, "not from my strength but from my stillness." She stopped there, set the pen down, and closed the notebook gently. Meanwhile, at the base, Private Leela Torres stood in the same med tent where she'd first learned how to breathe through panic. Now she was teaching others, the same tone, the same calm, the same steady eyes. When a recruit froze during a drill, Leela placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Pressure first, panic later." The others smiled. They'd all heard the phrase before, passed down like scripture. Afterward, she stepped outside to cool off. Davis was waiting there, watching her with quiet approval. "You sound like her," he said. Leela smiled. "I try." He shook his head. "You don't have to try, you just have to remember." She looked back toward the med tent. "Do you think she ever wonders if we're still following what she taught?" Davis smiled. "She doesn't need to wonder. People like that don't hope their lessons last, they know they will." A supply drone buzzed low overhead, casting moving shadows across the courtyard. As it passed, sunlight hit the plaque again, the metal letters glowing briefly. "For the ones who taught without shouting." It glimmered once faintly, as though acknowledging that the legacy still breathed. Weeks later, Davis received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a folded letter, and a medal wrapped in brown paper. The letter read, "Mark, they offered this to me for distinguished service. I can't wear it, you'll understand why. But medals aren't really for the person who earns them. They're reminders for those still learning what real service looks like. Keep it safe. Maybe one day when the noise gets loud again, hold it up as proof that silence once saved us." Davis sat there for a long time, turning the medal over in his hand. The metal was cool, heavy. He didn't hang it on a wall. He buried it in the sand beneath the plaque at dusk. "Let it belong to the ground," he whispered. "That's where all lessons start." Years passed. Soldiers came and went. Leela became chief medic. Ryan retired. Morales transferred to Central Command. Davis stayed until his knees couldn't handle the weight anymore. The courtyard endured through it all, unchanging, unassuming, eternal. On some mornings, when the wind was still, you could almost hear the faint echo of her footsteps. Or maybe that was just the memory of dignity refusing to fade. One final evening, long after retirement, Davis visited the base one last time. The desert had reclaimed half of it, dunes creeping over fences, silence swallowing the corners. The plaque was still there, weathered but legible. He sat down beside it, lowering himself carefully, his breathing steady but slow. The sun was falling, painting the horizon in the same amber light as the day she left. He took a folded notebook from his pocket, old, worn, the last of his letters. "If anyone finds this," he wrote, "remember this place wasn't built by orders. It was built by correction, by silence, by example, by one wounded soldier who refused to bow to cruelty." He set the notebook at the base of the plaque, his handwriting trembling now. Then he whispered into the wind, "You were right, Carter. Dignity doesn't need to shout, it just keeps walking." He sat there until the stars came out. Somewhere far away, in a classroom at the academy, Emily Carter stood before a new group of cadets. Her voice was steady, measured, familiar. "Service," she said, "isn't about being remembered. It's about what happens because you were there." A cadet raised her hand. "Ma'am, do you ever regret staying silent that day, when they mocked you?" Emily looked at her, eyes soft but unflinching. "No," she said, "because silence made them listen." The room stayed quiet for a long moment after that. No one took notes, they just heard her. That night, she walked outside to the academy's courtyard. The air was colder here, sharper, but the stars were the same, infinite and patient. She sat on a bench, hands in her lap, breathing deeply. There was peace in her stillness, the kind that doesn't erase pain but makes peace with it. She closed her eyes and spoke softly, maybe to herself, maybe to the ghost she carried with her. "I didn't need to win," she said. "I just needed to stay human." The wind moved through the trees, soft, approving. Years later, long after both she and Davis were gone, cadets at the academy told a story they couldn't trace the origin of. About a wounded soldier who never fought back with anger, who turned humiliation into teaching, who taught an entire command that silence can be strength. No one remembered her name. They just called her the quiet sergeant. And that was enough. Because legends don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper, through the tone of a generation that learned what grace under fire truly means. The base still stands in the desert, half reclaimed by sand, half preserved by memory. The plaque remains. The letters, though faded, still catch the light just enough to read. For the ones who taught without shouting. The wind moves through the empty courtyard, and if you listen closely, it almost sounds like footsteps. Slow, steady, unbroken. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.